can watch your coat walk out of the room too. For about 25 years.
Good evening, good afternoon. I'm gonna call this meeting to order. January 22nd, Charlottesville City Council meeting will come to order. This meeting was postponed from January the 16th out of abundance of caution because of the hazardous weather conditions on that day. Ms. Thomas, will you please call the roll?
Councilor Oshrin?
Here.
Councilor Payne?
Here.
Vice Mayor Pinkston?
Here.
Councilor Snook?
Here.
Mayor Wade?
Here. Is there a motion to approve or amend the agenda?
Move for approval of the agenda.
The second? I need a second.
Second.
Please cast your vote. Oh, I'm sorry.
We did have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, you had a question.
Sorry,
I'm sorry.
I'm looking for the verbiage that you sent me.
I think it would be good.
Yes. Okay, I am requesting to add something under other business to amend the agenda about revisiting the TJPDC committee appointment.
Yes, I'm fine with adding that.
I'll second that.
So we're voting to amend the agenda?
Move to,
have
yes,
To approve
that.
it as amended.
approve the agenda as amended.
Okay.
Yes. Lloyd had seconded your final.
And that will go,
Okay, so.
that will go under other business.
Other business,
Yep.
okay. So can we place our votes? Okay. The meeting will be divided into three main sections. The first is a work session to be where we hear and discuss presentations that do not require a council vote, followed by a closed meeting, then the city council business meeting at 6:30. The first item, well, we were going to get a report in person from the Seville Scholarship Committee, but we're going to accept their report this evening, and we're going to hear, is that still the case? Madam
Right,
Clerk?
they had a conflict, so
Right.
they could not
Okay.
attend tonight.
We're now going to hear the report from the Charlottesville Area Transit Alternative Fuel Study results with recommendations. Mr. Williams, the Transit Director, will introduce the presentation.
Thank you very much. Mayor Wade, Vice Mayor Pinkston, members of council, just waiting for the presentation to come up. But while we're doing that, I just want to set the stage. If you remember and recall, it's been about almost 18 months now since we started down this path of putting together the alternative fuel study. With the last time we were before you, which was in July, we said we would come back to you with recommendations. We're at that point now. We think this, what will be in front of you. Why is it advancing? I don't know what happened.
The wrong direction. There you go.
No, it was going by itself.
Might have got stuck.
There we go. Before you, we were talking about making sure that we brought you a recommendation that looked at where we are as an organization, that was going to provide us with what we think is the best path forward to getting us to zero emission by 2050. Also, we wanted to make sure that we are being good stewards of the public dollar. The plan that we had put in place, the study plan that we put in place still has the 15 routes, 26 operating blocks or 26 vehicles at peak period of time. We're still the schedules that we're talking about for our operating about 14 to 15 hours per day. So the models that the recommendation that we're going to introduce to you basically looks at getting us a model that allows us to be reliable, dependable, and frequent, because those are the things that make transit usable for all in this area. With that, I'm going to bring up Sam Sink, Kimberly Horn, one of our consultants. We actually have two other consultants, if we can promote them, that couldn't make it in person today, but they should be online.
Say their names.
Paul Elman, and John Jackson. Paul Ellman is a licensed engineer, and John Jackson is actually one of the key planners for the state's transition plan for all transit agencies. So he's working with VDRPT. So I think we have the right team that's been helping us pull this together. And with that, I'm going to introduce you, Sam Singh.
All right. Thank you, Garland. Let's see if I can figure this out. There we go. So just a reminder, I know we were here back in July presenting on the study, but the overall goal of this is to achieve that 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and ultimately get to net zero by 2050. And so to do that, we're focusing in on a couple of things. One is to determine what that preferred cleaner fuel type for CAT buses should be. We'll also be determining a high-level implementation strategy and a timeline for that implementation strategy to bring in that preferred fuel type or types of vehicles. So in order to look at these different types or alternative fuel types, we're really looking at three considerations broadly. First, resources. What are the costs? Secondly, operations. What is it going to take to implement it? And third, sustainability. What are the benefits? Under resources, you have things like what kind of new training will it require for mechanics and operators? Where is the fuel type going to come from? Under operations, you have things like how flexible and scalable is this technology? How reliable is it? And under sustainability, ultimately, what are the local and global environmental impacts? And is it a resilient technology? So this table, I believe you've seen before. I won't read the whole thing, but just as a reminder, we did look at three types of alternative fuel technologies. First was natural gas. So that can be either CNG, compressed natural gas, or RNG, renewable natural gas. We also looked at battery electric bus and fuel cell electric bus, also known as hydrogen. So zeroing in on emissions, this slide generally focuses more on tailpipe emissions, but global emissions are obviously part of this study and very important. And it's worth noting that although BEB and fuel cell or hydrogen buses are labeled as having zero tailpipe emissions, which is true, ultimately global emissions for these technologies are very much reliant upon the power source that was used to generate the electricity for the batteries or to generate the hydrogen fuel. On the hydrogen side, I think you may be familiar with green hydrogen, which is produced with renewable energy, but there's also things like gray hydrogen, which is much more prevalent in the market, and that's produced with something like natural gas, a fossil fuel. So there are global emissions with one, but not necessarily the other. Looking at natural gas or RNG, it's worth noting that although you can reduce emissions with this technology, ultimately you're never going to get to that net zero emissions locally and globally that we're trying to get to by 2050. Looking at infrastructure, I'll note that natural gas and hydrogen will both require a similar type of investment in refueling infrastructure at the CAT depot. You need containers to store the gas, to pressurize it, and to pump it to fuel the vehicles. With battery electric bus, you also need hefty infrastructure investment. Some of that may be off-site in the form of working with the utility provider to upgrade the transmission infrastructure to be able to provide enough power to the site to power a fleet of battery electric vehicles. And also, of course, you would need charging on-site at the depot to charge the buses every night. So taking the information from that chart and starting to zero in on the pros and cons of each technology. With CNG or RNG, it is a cost-effective technology. It's also a very mature technology. There's many agencies around the state that are using this and around the region. It's very resilient to operate. If your power goes down, you can still fuel your buses with CNG or RNG. On the con side, though, it does produce emissions, which, obviously is a very big con for a study like this where we're trying to get to zero emissions. It's also noteworthy that when we're talking about renewable natural gas, that may not be commercially available nearby. You may have to bring it in from a long distance away, and that is a consideration when you're thinking about the global emissions impacts of that fuel type. With battery electric, in the pro column, obviously it's got zero tailpipe emissions. It is a mature technology. This has been around for a few years now, and many agencies have piloted it and implemented it, and there's a definitive source of the fuel. You know what your grid makeup is, where that electricity is coming from, and whether it's renewable or not. So you know the ultimate emission story behind that fuel that's being used to power your batteries. On the con side, it may require a larger fleet. These buses do have a higher cost than diesel or CNG buses, and there are range concerns, and that's kind of what drives that requirement for a larger fleet. Obviously the technology is still evolving, ranges are going up, but it's not necessarily a panacea, and it is something that, does influence the recommendations and the reliability of the service that's being put out on the street. With hydrogen fuel cells, again, zero tailpipe emissions, just like battery electric, and you do have the resilient operations similar to what you have with CNG or RNG. However, they also have a high cost to deploy. You not only have the high vehicle cost like you have with battery electric, but you also have a higher infrastructure cost to be able to bring in that fuel storage and pumping infrastructure to your depot. It's also, there's somewhat of a lack of supply of hydrogen fuel on the market right now. This is more of an emerging technology, so the fuel market hasn't quite caught up. It's especially difficult to get green hydrogen, although the federal government is making significant investments in hydrogen hubs in the region. Two were announced sort of nearby. One, the Appalachian Hydrogen Hub, which is centered on western Pennsylvania and Ohio and West Virginia, and the other is the hydrogen hub centered on the Philadelphia, New Jersey, Delaware area. So it does look like fuel supply is improving, but that is something where it's an evolving technology, so it's in the con column for now. Looking at the overall greenhouse gas emissions, so this chart shows the emissions if we went 100% in the direction of each of these different technologies shown here by 2050. This is based on what we call the A-Fleet model, which is a nationally accepted model for determining the global operating emissions of these different transit technologies. We'll start at the top. So you do see an increase in emissions initially. This corresponds with the increase in the number of buses being purchased to use to put into service. CAT is roughly doubling its investment in the amount of service it's putting on the street between now and about 2028. So that's why you see that initial increase. And then you see the top line, which is our baseline of diesel buses. Below that, we see CNG implementation, and you get only about a 7% reduction in your greenhouse gas emissions with that implementation. Moving down, if we look at gray hydrogen, or gray FCEB here, you'll see that you end up with almost 40% reduction, but it doesn't get near zero, which is what we're looking for by 2050. Moving on to green hydrogen, if we can find green renewable hydrogen, that does get you that 99% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And similarly with battery electric, that also gets you that 99% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The different points along those lines correspond with different goals that Dominion has set for how the percentage of its power generation that's going to be renewable by those years. And then there's a linear connection between those different points. So that's kind of why it's not immediately down all the way to 99%, 100%.
Could I interrupt and ask a quick question?
Certainly.
Thank you. So the line that's plummeted all the way past zero, which Which fuel is that? I want that kind.
So that's renewable natural gas.
Okay.
And the reason that it shows up as greater than 100% reduction is because it is taking methane that would otherwise be released into the atmosphere
I see.
and using it to generate power, and it turns into CO2 emissions.
I see.
So since CO2 is about 28 times less harmful than
Got it.
methane, that's how it shows up like that.
Okay. Thank you. And this percent reduction is all in, it's not just tailpipe emissions,
Yeah, this is global.
this is global, this is the total net, when everything is all factored in terms of power supply and how the energy is being made and so forth.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Does that include the transportation costs of getting hydrogen from New Jersey down here?
It does not. So that could be an issue with hydrogen. That could be an issue with CNG or RNG as well. Depends on what fuel you're looking at. But that would. It also doesn't include the emissions related to the manufacture or end-of-life disposal of any of these assets. So it is not a perfect model.
So what does it include?
It includes the operations emissions. So what it takes to generate the power and then to burn that power via the battery or the fuel cell or the CNG engine.
Could I, while we're on this particular slide, what is the assumption that is being made about, I take it that there is an assumption that's being made about how quickly it's being implemented and how long the legacy vehicles continue to operate?
This is actually more of an assumption that we could just put in all of these vehicles by 2040, because that's what our model shows that we can implement by based on the current retirement cycle of existing vehicles. So by 2040, you're looking at 100% of each of these on the graph, and then that number at 2040 and forward is based entirely upon the mix, but you're only getting credit for like the number of vehicles that you have currently.
So
If that makes sense.
in 2040, as I recall, we were told that these vehicles, that the buses generally have a life expectancy of 12 to 14 years.
12 years is when you can retire them if
Okay.
you've met the mileage as well.
Yeah. And so if at 2040, if 2040 is the target, that suggests, I guess, that we have fully implemented this purchasing program by 2028 or so.
Yes, I believe that's, we should begin, not to jump ahead to recommendations, but we should begin getting alternative fueled vehicles on site next year. There is grant money in place to buy 2 battery electric buses, and those will be purchased this year, delivered next year.
Is there an assumption built into this graph, and perhaps more importantly, if there is such an assumption, does it differ from one fuel technology to the other about how fast things would be implemented?
No, that's not baked into this graph.
Okay. Will we get something on that later?
Yeah, we'll
Okay.
talk about that.
Don't want to jump ahead.
No.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
I have one quick question. For this chart, this is data that you've all done the math on, or is this sourced from other studies and?
Yeah, so the model actually has baked into it information from actual studies and implementations across the country, and so the math is baked into the model. So we can't take credit for that, but it is based on real-world experience and what people have seen. So if we're looking at the different scenarios for implementing these different technologies and kind of how the costs and the emissions reductions compare. I won't read through the whole chart, but I'll note that diesel is the baseline condition here. The long-term emissions reduction represents where we'd be by 2050, and the near-term reduction represents where we expect to be by 2030. And this is all based on the CATS system optimization plan and the service changes and increases that are baked into that. So we've got 5 scenarios here. I mentioned diesel as baseline. With battery electric, we came up with 3 scenarios, and I believe you saw these in July, but we wanted to show the full range of potential implementation of battery electric. There's a lot of discussion about, how rosy the picture should be. So we wanted to look at kind of a worst-case scenario, sort of a medium scenario, and then all the way down to the rosiest possible picture for battery electric technology. So beginning with our worst-case scenario, you'll see that on row 2 here with requiring 94 vehicles. This is based on needing a roughly 1.6 buses for every 1 bus that you would have under the diesel scenario. So obviously the costs are more. However, you are meeting that long-term emissions reduction goal. Kind of that medium scenario, the Goldilocks, would be battery electric with fast charging. With that, you're looking at about a 1.1 to 1 vehicle replacement ratio. Again, you get those emissions reductions. The cost is significantly less than the worst case scenario, but because this technology is more expensive than diesel technology and you would need facility infrastructure upgrades, you do see an increase in cost with it. Looking at the kind of rosy picture, this is assuming, this is the battery electric low estimate, and this assumes that battery technology, battery capacity increases exactly as fast as we need it. Fast charging technology, if part of it would work flawlessly, and that there's no increase in cost associated with that increase in battery capacity or anything. Not saying that's probable, but we want to assume or look at what that assumption would play out like. So you're seeing a 1 or 1.1 to 1 vehicle replacement ratio. Again, you get the emissions reductions you're looking for, and the cost is, again, less than the electric with fast charging or than the worst case scenario battery electric, but it's still going to be more than diesel because these buses are just more expensive and it will require an infrastructure upgrade.
Sorry to interrupt again. Can you help me understand the battery electric low estimate? What is that option supposed to help us compare to? Is it the road just above it, battery electric with fast charging? I get that you're trying to help us look at scenarios, but
yeah, so it's basically trying to say if battery electric didn't have the increases in vehicles that modeling suggests would be required, if the technology is what we need from it when we need it, it's kind of comparing it to diesel.
I see.
So
in other words, if in 3 years from now they have a breakthrough with some sort of beyond lithium type batteries, and all of a sudden we can essentially use the same number of buses that we have now. Okay, yeah, see that. Thank you.
And then moving on to the hydrogen scenario, because that has a range that is very similar to diesel, you wouldn't need additional vehicles. You do get the emissions reductions you're looking for. This does assume green hydrogen can be sourced or produced, so that is an assumption. But again, you see those higher costs associated with that zero emission vehicle and with the infrastructure needed to fuel it. And CNG, again, that's a 1-to-1 replacement. The range is very similar to diesel. You don't get the emissions reductions that you're looking for, at least not with CNG, and even though RNG is over 100%, as we saw in the previous graph, we know that there are still local tailpipe emissions associated with that. And with the cost, CNG and RNG buses, these are very commonly available and significantly cheaper to purchase than battery electric or hydrogen, so that's reflected in the cost here.
Does the vehicle care whether it's CNG or RNG?
No, it's the same vehicle, same fueling infrastructure, it's just where you got the fuel from.
Yeah.
So can you just give me an estimate, like how much a diesel bus is, how much a battery bus is, and how much a hydrogen bus is?
So diesel, you might see something on the order of 550K. Garland, you could probably speak to this better. I'm sure you look at the state contract more than that.
Absolutely. So right now we're buying diesel vehicles for about $548,000. We just put in, we will be able to put in within the next 60 days an order for 2 battery electric vehicles. When we made our submission to the state, they pointed out that they thought our estimate was low, so they bumped our number up. It's basically $1.2 million per vehicle for a battery electric vehicle.
So about double the cost?
A little bit more than double the cost.
And go ahead, sorry.
And then the hydrogen is comparable to the battery electric, but probably about another $100,000 on top of it.
And then with federal and state money, what is the cost to the locality directly for diesel versus those 2 battery electric buses?
So depending on what grant source we can get, our numbers can be very low, or they could be, depending on, the grant we have, it could be 10%, it could be 20%. But the majority of what we're being able to buy off of the state contract, we're only, the city is only responsible for about 4%
Okay, thank you.
at this point.
How many percent?
4.
4.
And are those all kind of the standard large size buses we see? Do they make smaller versions?
So we're an urban style system, and part of what we are trying to, it's the capacity. To go the smaller vehicles, we don't have the capacity to carry as many people, so we would potentially have to double the size of the fleet and have them on a much higher frequency to carry just as many people. But right now we're running 35 footers that allow us to carry 55 people seated, and about another 15 to 20 standing.
And how, this might be veering a little bit from this presentation, but, is ridership capacity full?
Depending on which route you're asking. So if there are 3 routes in our system that are at capacity, and having smaller vehicles would be a concern for us with that. Now, I caveat that because the frequency on the other routes is not where we want it to be, so the ridership is not where we are hoping that it will be. If we can get becoming more reliable and more frequent, we know our ridership, there's pent-up demand. Our ridership will go up.
Right, I know there's a delicate balance between
Correct.
a convenient route and ridership, but that also probably comes into factor with the routes that are at capacity. If they're run more frequently, then each bus would have fewer people, because not everyone would have to wait for that one time the bus shows up.
So, well, they're packing the buses, but yes.
Which routes are those?
5, 7, and the trolley. 5 and the 7, we actually have 3 vehicles on each one of those routes in the AM and PM. And as we build our model, we will turn all of those routes into bidirectional, which means we will double the size of each one of those routes.
Yeah, I've ridden this 7 during rush hour. I know what you're talking about there. Okay, thank you.
All right, are there any other questions on this slide before we move on? So I'm actually going to hand it off to my colleague, Paul Ellman. He is a licensed engineer, and he's worked on several zero emissions vehicle studies. Paul, are you able to present?
Yes, Paul is being promoted now.
Thank you.
Unmute. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, welcome. Thank you. I'm Paul Hellman, also with Kimley Horn. One regional example of another transit agency who's currently assessing a transition of their fleet to zero emissions is Arlington County Transit in Northern Virginia. They currently run an all compressed natural gas CNG fleet, and they're also looking to transition to zero emissions by utilizing a combination of RNG, renewable natural gas, BEB, and hydrogen fuel cell. We undertook a study with them that we started in 2022, And we did some modeling, and the BEBs and the FCBs were assessed at different conditions with both AC and heat. And it resulted in the very success rates on completing the blocks with an estimate of how many additional buses would be needed to be 100% successful in completing those blocks, as you can see on this table. A couple notes about that. So footnote 2 is about doing a BB with during the winter with heat, using auxiliary heat, and that would be a fossil fueled auxiliary heater. So that allowed the success rate to be higher because the heater was utilizing fossil fuels and not relying solely on the battery electric bus. Footnote 3 on there, we did a modeling effort using on-route charging, 2 locations within Arlington County, but the caveat on that is obviously, that could be challenging to implement more broadly, either across the city or county due to grid capacity considerations. And finally, the 4th footnote on there, for the 4 pilot BEBs that Arlington County has actually now purchased, they're expected to arrive for delivery in 2025. Those batteries, have a higher battery capacity, 588 kilowatt hours and 686 kilowatt hours than the modeling scenarios that were utilized. So this could actually improve some of the performance and change those results. Next slide.
Well, before you go on, I'm not sure if I understand the success rate that.
I can explain that a little bit more. So essentially, the way when agencies, and Garland can tell you more on this too, when you do your scheduling, you break out the routes in the different blocks, right? And a block is essentially how long, one operator can operate a route before they have to change over, right? So under this scenario, the success rate is the percentage of blocks that could be completed under, if it's a battery electric bus, under the available charging, that bus would undertake, either from the facility if there's no on-route charging, or utilizing on-route charging, during its actual route, right? So it's really the ability to perform that service that's scheduled in the blocks for that route. So if it doesn't meet 100%, it's that less, routes that aren't able to be completed based on that. So, what ends up happening is you need to have more buses available to perform that same equivalent amount of service. So that's really what that metric represents.
Another question, obviously looking at this data for the winter, the auxiliary heat appears necessary. Could you just explain a little bit what that means in practice, kind of the cost of that, the feasibility of that per bus?
Yeah, I think it varies, and we can get you some of the information about, the cost of different types of auxiliary heaters. In fact, I think we were talking to Blacksburg Transit the other day, and they've actually had some challenges in this climate, even getting the auxiliary heaters to function properly, and they're looking into that. They don't know if that's just something on the manufacturing side or just the extreme cold that we've been experiencing. But, essentially, if you look at the second line on this, it's winter with heat. Only 13% of the blocks were able to be completed because, essentially the battery electric bus battery is performing all of the heat, providing power for all of the heat. And that significantly cuts back on the ability of these buses to complete the blocks. As you can see, you know, you would need 46 additional buses, or Arlington would for this, to complete all of those blocks successfully. So heat is a significant, you know, drain on the battery. And, you know, if you're doing auxiliary heat, that certainly helps on the performance of the buses. But, you know, if it's a fossil fueled auxiliary heater, then obviously you have some of the emissions challenges with that.
Could I ask, just practically speaking, what does that look like, auxiliary heat in a bus? Is that just a little radiator or something on the floor, or?
Usually, they mount, they're rooftop mounted, I believe,
Oh,
right?
okay.
I think- Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Sure. Okay, next slide. So, you know, for the art study, there was a number of variables that the county took into consideration, and also risks that went into developing and evaluating the various implementation scenarios. You know, we've obviously mentioned the cost and the potential challenges of doing on-route charging based on grid capacity and, you know, available land and impacts on the environment. In addition, we knew in Arlington, similar to Charlottesville, there's significant space constraints on building new maintenance facilities, you know, to house a lot of this equipment. And, you know, there's always challenges in land acquisition for all these agencies. Arlington had an additional concern because they were doing a transit strategic plan as required by DRPT, and they're actually looking at additional service. So they obviously would need to expand the fleet even further to provide that. And they're also part of the regional network working with WMATA, and Metrobus there also is looking at an entire bus network redesign, which could also impact additional fleet facilities, you know, for the county. You know, there's a couple other risks on here that apply to, some apply to BEB. Obviously, you know, the grid capacity is a significant issue, and, you know, is it a green grid? You know, Dominion is, you know, on a path to get to a green grid, but that is still several years away. On the hydrogen side, there's, you know, concerns about code requirements, you know, and I think that those are being addressed through the implementation of fuel cell, but there's always issues in terms of, you know, locating the structures and the facilities on these maintenance sites. So those were a couple of things that were covered by Arlington. Their current plans are to do pilots of both BEB and hydrogen. So their approach is a little bit about looking at resiliency, particularly with climate change. They want to make sure they can still put all the service that they currently offer and what they're looking to expand to in place. So yeah, they've purchased 4 BEBs that'll arrive in 2025, and now they're currently considering a pilot program for the hydrogen fuel cells, and they're also looking at a test fit of their current light maintenance facility to potentially accommodate actually the production of hydrogen on that site. So that is their current plan. Sam?
Thanks, Paul. All right, let's see if I have control. There we go. So moving on to our recommendations. First, we recommend that CAT transition to a zero emissions fleet by 2040. This is in support of the city's climate goals for carbon neutral operations by 2050. I'll get into a chart in a couple of slides that kind of shows how that looks. CAT should pilot 2 fuel types for transition, both battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell. The battery electric pilot, as I mentioned, those vehicles, we do have grant funding, or CAT does have grant funding for the purchase of them, and they will be delivered next year. With hydrogen fuel cell pilot, we recommend that those purchases occur in 2027. So battery electric should go first because the money's in place, but also so that with the hydrogen fuel cell, we have time to line up a potential fuel source, be that on-site generation or trucked in from somewhere. During the pilot testing, CAT should continue to expand its fleet to meet the capital requirements of planned service improvements. It's worth noting the other piece of this carbon neutrality is getting more people on the bus, and those investments represent an almost doubling of CAT service that they have on the street today.
Could I ask
Sir.
towards that, is this the constrained network vision? Or,
No, sir, we haven't even gotten there yet.
Okay.
So this is just our plan to, if you remember, we brought to council's attention, we did a system optimization study.
Okay.
When
That's-
COVID hit us.
that's this.
And that's what this is.
okay, so
If
for
we're-
future hopes and aspirations?
It would be even bigger. Our
Okay.
system would be bigger.
Okay.
So we're recommending that the final fleet mix be determined based on pilot testing and continued improvements that are being made to ZEB technologies. Certainly with both battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell, these technologies are not static. There are constant improvements and resources being developed for these technologies. So that's something that will be evolving while these pilots are going on and prior to determination of a final fleet mix. And finally, we recommend that charging and fueling take place at the CAT facility. So begin with depot charging. The city would identify a source for hydrogen fuel and also investigate on-site green hydrogen production as part of the site planning effort. And the city would also investigate on-site generation of green electricity for charging BEBs at the CAT facility as part of the site planning effort. And the site planning effort is kind of the next phase of this overarching study into the feasibility and transition planning for zero emissions buses.
Could I ask another question? So the second bullet point, the city will investigate on-site generation of electricity. We're not actually planning to burn stuff to generate electricity, right? Are you talking about by on-site generation, but the relevant transformers and charging systems and all of that? Is that what we're talking about?
We're talking about green energy generation, so likely solar panels. And the potential for that, how much energy we could likely expect and what size
So
fleet
like
that would
battery
power.
kind of
Yeah, it could
storage
either,
of power?
it could be stored in a battery. It could directly be used to generate hydrogen fuel. We're going to look at all of the options with that.
That seems pretty complicated. Okay.
Is there any locality that's doing that?
Yeah, there's actually, there's a few. One that comes to mind is MTD in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. They leased space next door, which is owned by their, I believe it's the wastewater treatment authority that's local to them, and they have about 8 acres of solar panels that they use to generate electricity to produce green hydrogen on site, which powers their pilot of 2 hydrogen vehicles.
So, and we've had a few presentations on this, and so my memory may be foggy, but I thought that there could potentially be a conflict of having hydrogen, battery, and gas and diesel all together, like one spark or something. I mean, that could happen anywhere, but did I hear that wrong?
What we were talking about is our current site doesn't allow us to do everything we need. So there is an adjacent piece of property that we will have to acquire to build out our new model regardless. And there should be ample space for us to space both models.
Okay.
So this slide shows how we would get from today's fleet mix to a 100% zero emissions fleet by 2050. You'll see we actually, in this model, get to it by 2040. So that 10 years of difference, that gives us room for the what if. And I'll also note here, this kind of represents the quickest you could get there. It's based on 12-year lifespans for vehicles and being able to meet those mileage goals. Things may happen, like what happened with the hydrogen buses, or not hydrogen, the hybrid buses that CAT has today, where it may take a little longer to retire them. That 10 years gives us buffer to deal with that potential.
And just quickly, so it's 12 years if it's reached a certain number of miles, correct?
Yes. It's
So-
half a million miles.
What's kind of on the field, like the average lifespan? Because it seems like it's usually 12 years is earlier than the amount of miles driven, if my memory is correct.
So CAT's current average age, I believe, is about 14 years. So I think that's representative of the fleet mix they have now. That's not necessarily going to be the case with battery electric or hydrogen or some other technology. I think a lot of that is driven by those hybrid vehicles that they have.
Thank you.
Can you help me out with the colors, please?
Yeah.
I guess if I brought it up on my screen, I could tell. So right now, basically, we've got a mix of gasoline, diesel, and hybrid.
Correct.
Am I reading that right? And
Yes.
then we go over to 2026, maybe, and what's the blue that's in there?
The blue comes in 2025. Those are battery electric buses. So that
Okay.
represents those 2 pilot vehicles that we expect to arrive next year.
Okay.
And then beginning in 2028, you'll see the addition of the hydrogen fuel cell pilots.
Okay.
And so you have about 3 years there where you have both battery electric and hydrogen on site. And you're piloting them, comparing them, figuring out
see.
how they operate.
And
at
then
CAT.
as we get past 20, at some point, the green, the dark green or forest green, I guess, is just our marker for a zero emissions bus, whether that's BEB or FCEB or whatever.
Correct.
Okay. Interesting.
So,
That's the purpose of the pilot.
and speaking of pilot, so during that 2 years, will CAT do that, or the Sustainability Office do that, or?
That's CAT. So when we get the vehicles, part of why we want to do the pilot is we'll be able to test the vehicles on all of our routes. So it won't be just isolated to a couple of routes. We'll be able to see whether it works on the heavier routes or the lower producing routes at this point in time. Topography plays a huge issue with this, and being able to test it will tell us how they're going to perform here in Charlottesville.
So, Garland, would you be able to, sometimes when you get something new, you trying to get the kinks out, and so you might have more maintenance, but that's because it's the first or second model. How will you kind of say, well, this could be good, but it had a lot of maintenance issues, but that could be taken care of, next model or something?
Great question, Mr. Mayor. So part of what we're going to do is a part of the pilot is one of the things we're going to do is buy an extended warranty. So it allows us to take care of those.
You got that phone call too?
We made it. So we're going to make sure we get an extended warranty so we're able to adequately test these items, right? The technology is rapidly changing. And hopefully the model that we buy doesn't have any of the kinks, right? Maybe we get to the point where it's one of the older kinks has been worked out. Now we are getting into the model where we're buying something that has a larger range for us. The goal, though, would be to figure out how, because, eventually we want to get to zero emissions across the fleet. We're going to need to figure out what that mix looks like. I am not in favor of having one single source. I'll just tell you that because it puts us at jeopardy. I am concerned about having dual because it allows us an opportunity to be able, in case something doesn't work, we'll always have some source to rely on and have some semblance of transit out on the road. That is my goal. And part of that is to also maintain that we have, because our model right now requires us to have ridership to generate, we need to generate ridership to generate funding from the state. And if we have a long extended period of time where we can't operate, then our potential funding comes down from the state. So there's reasons for this and trying to test it and get it right. I have often reminded Mr. Snook when he was mayor that council is not just council, but you're also recognized by the FTA as the board of Charlottesville Area Transit. So part of what this study is basically saying is the board of Charlottesville Area Transit is going to acknowledge how we're going to get to transition from where we are now to zero emissions. You're putting your stamp of approval on that. So when we go to the feds, we're saying this is where we feel good about getting this and going to after funding. So we need to, I hope that we're going to be very careful in our deliberations and making sure that we're able to test this out. So when we do make a decision, that we're going to make the decision that allows us to transition and still be reliable.
And I see you're still, the max assumption here is still the 58 buses.
At this point.
Okay.
That could change.
So I
That
guess-
part of the testing will dictate that.
So 20 years from now, maybe if you had half of your buses BEBs and half of them FCEBs, you'd be happy with that?
Absolutely.
Okay. I see.
For the non-scientists who are tuning in, can you talk a little more about hydrogen fuel cell technology, where it's been in use, how it works, why there aren't as many fueling options available? And just kind of generally a little more in depth about the science there.
Sure. So hydrogen, it is an energy-dense gas. It is less energy-dense than something like gasoline, but it is more energy-dense than, say, the power used to charge a battery. So it's attractive in that sense. The hydrogen fuel is used to power a motor that then charges a battery kind of as it goes. It's a smaller battery pack than the large battery packs needed to charge a battery electric bus. So the bus is lighter and a little less costly in the battery department. Where it's been implemented, I think, and Paul or John, help me out here, I believe Sunline in California has a pretty sizable operation with it. And there's one in Ohio whose name is escaping me.
SARTA.
There you go, SARTA.
Yep, SARTA. And I believe is it Canton, Ohio?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, Canton, Ohio.
Thank you, John. So there are agencies that are implementing this. However, it's still more of a nascent technology than battery electric because it does take a lot of energy to produce hydrogen fuel. So, I think the appeal of hydrogen is that it can be green. However, you have to have enough renewable energy sources set up to produce it in a green way. And I think we're just now, starting to see those large-scale investments in green energy production come to fruition. John says also AC Transit in Oakland, California, they have a mix of battery electric and fuel cell electric buses. They actually publish a great kind of study. I believe it's updated either quarterly or annually, where they're comparing how those buses are performing against one another, just as a side note. But, I think there's not a lot of interest necessarily in gray hydrogen or hydrogen that is produced with fossil fuels in general. So I think you will see more implementation of hydrogen, at least in the transit space, as the renewable energy comes online to be able to produce it at scale in a green way. I think there's also, you see more agencies looking at hydrogen as more of the limitations with battery electric become clear. Battery electric obviously still has a lot of promise and is performing well for a lot of agencies, but it does have limitations. And so I think agencies are, beginning more and more to look at a mixed fleet and having both technologies, if that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, thanks. And then for the ones you mentioned, Sunline, Canton, and AC Transit, and even you mentioned the Champaign-Urbana group also, are they all, you said I think Sunline was a little more robust, but is that like 4 buses, or is it like how much of this is beyond a pilot program?
Sure. John, I'll let you chime in with that. I think you have a better handle on the numbers.
Yes. So I would say summary for AC Transit's fleet. Definitely over 20. They've been doing this for about, gosh, I want to say at least 7 or 8 years. They're in the process of fully transitioning their fleet, but this is definitely beyond a pilot program. And they've been very open. We've talked to them and discussed with them about their fleet, about, they get calls about having tours to let other agencies come in and see their fleet and what it takes to transition and look at their maintenance facilities, and then just to hear the story about why they decided to go with both battery electric and fuel cell as probable options, because you do have to look at both, because every place is different. There's really not a one-size-fits-all option. So for them, it was more just a matter of looking at both options and testing them both out and seeing how they both work. But it seems like thus far they've had success with both. They do also have, the weather aspect, because it is warmer in the Bay Area. But to them, that wasn't a determinant in terms of what they specifically were going to go after.
Yeah, I believe they have AC Transit is currently operating 36 FCEBs, and they actually have procured to obtain 24 additional by 2025. So by 25, they'll actually be up to 60 fuel cell electric buses. Foothill Transit currently has 33, and they also are in the process of ordering 19 additional, so they would be up to 52. Sunline Transit in Thousand Palms, California has 20 FCEBs, and Victor Valley has 12, and are looking at ordering 11 additional. So pretty robust FCEB use in California. Locally, Montgomery County in Maryland also has ordered FCEBs. I believe they ordered 2 to 4 as a test pilot. They have an interesting facility near Silver Spring. They actually did an energy as a service concessionaire agreement with a firm called Alpha Structure. So this Brookville facility they operate actually has a microgrid, and then it also has solar panels that provide the ability to manufacture green hydrogen on site. So it's a fully self-contained both microgrid, and then they have the solar panels that help develop the green hydrogen production on site. And I think that's coming online 2025 or 2026 in Maryland.
Thanks.
And then, just to add, for those on the call, I'm going to go ahead and drop a link in the chat. I don't know how accessible it is, but CalSTART, a national nonprofit, puts out a zero emissions bus census for the United States every single year called Zeroing In on ZEBs, and it has numbers of every single transit agency in the United States that is either procuring zero emissions buses or currently has them in their fleet. And it breaks it down by FTA region and by specific transit agency. So it could be a good source for all of you to take a look at and just see where this is being done. I mean, not only just within your region, but just all around the country.
Is this the last slide?
There's one more.
Okay, because I'd like to go back to the one at some point, if we have a minute, that has all the costs.
Certainly.
The different type, if we can wait, if you've got.
Okay. The next slide is, I think, quick. So the next steps for the study are to finalize the feasibility study, and then we would begin the conceptual site design work that I described earlier, and ultimately complete a zero emissions transition plan that is required by FDA to seek some of these special grant funds that are out there right now. And it's also worth noting that CAT already has been awarded $1.6 million to fund the federally required environmental review and the 30% design of the facility expansion and site improvements.
Fantastic. Great presentation.
Thank you.
right there. So I've seen this slide several times in the RTP and the MPO and the other acronym type meetings we go to.
Yes, sir.
Alphabet soup. I get the fact that I don't know what my hangup is about hydrogen. I have some concerns about it. We have an administration now that's pushing it. We might not have an administration that's going to be as forward thinking. I don't know. Can't predict the future, but electricity is a lot easier to get in my mind than hydrogen in terms of its access. So if I look at battery BEB with fast charging, the third one down, and I understand the point about the heaters in the wintertime and all of those things, but if you're talking about basically having to invest, I don't know if those are like capacitor chargers or whatever that are sort of sprinkled around midway through bus routes. Again, I can appreciate why you'd want to have two different types of fuel. That makes sense to me. But if BEBs are going to get better and better, and we can invest in fast chargers that are, again, strategically located throughout the network, that just still seems to me to make the most sense, because your batteries are going to get better, and even if they don't add up to what they need to be, if you have enough of those chargers sprinkled around, you're not having to go with. I get it's a pilot study, so maybe we'll come out of this and hydrogen. I'll be convinced it's amazing. But hydrogen feels a little bit like fusion. People have always been talking about it. The next 10 years is going to be the next big thing. I'm skeptical. I hope to be proven wrong. But if I were an engineer designing the system and trying to think about, technology that was starting to become mature, which is the electric buses, the batteries that they were using. We're not talking about hybrid. We're talking about genuinely, those should get better and better. And then if we think in terms of the fact that our grid should get better and better from Dominion, and then if we want to think in terms of like reliability and contingency planning and all that, having the fast charging stations strategically placed, I don't know. I still like that third row. So.
May I just give you? No, I think your comments are very warranted. The concern that I have is one, site control. When we're talking about putting fast charging stations around, the space that it takes, not being able to adequately potentially secure those sites is a little bit of a concern for me. Should be a concern for us as an organization. The items that you're talking about, the overhead or underneath the induction doesn't work as well as the overhead, is what we're finding out from our colleagues. But the overhead equipment is large, and it's not something that we go into this lightly. And if we're talking about trying to do it right outside the downtown station, I don't think we have enough space. So there's concern there. We'd probably have to figure out a place. We'd have to acquire some pieces of land.
So these fast chargers are a pretty significant investment, difficult to work with.
It's not necessarily difficult to work with. It's the infrastructure that needs to be built out to make it work properly. And when we're talking about fast charging, it's not you pull up and like you fill your car. Fast charging is 15, 20 minutes sitting there. So we'll have to, our model gets changed a little bit because you would have to either one, pull it out of service to let the fast charging happen, which means you have to have another bus anyway, which could work, but that means we'd have to have potentially 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 more buses to make that model consistently work, because people still need to get to work or get to their point of activities.
Okay, thank you.
For a fast charge, about how long does that actually take to charge it?
Between 15 and 20 minutes to top off, and it's not 100%. You're getting 10%.
You're just filling it.
We're just topping it off. That's what the fast charging does. It tops it off to allow it to continue to add hours. So we have a model that we are operating between 15 and 18 hours right now. The fast charging allows us, because normally you're getting 10 to 12 hours optimal. If we're topping it off, then we expand that model.
Are there some routes that we run that a battery electric bus could operate all day on without a problem?
Yes, there were a few.
And I guess how many can we do that way versus how many would require some supplement of some sort?
So I'm trying to recall it from the 17th presentation, but if you go back and I think it was 3 routes that we were very, that we looked at, there were no problems. We'd be able to do those. There were maybe 2 others that we thought we possibly could do, and then there were others we were concerned about being able to, without having some sort of, topping off, we know we weren't going to be able to operate the system. When we're talking about securing everything in fueling at CAT, we're talking about 8-10 hours. We still have to have another bus to finish the second piece of the route, whether that's diesel, whether that's whatever. In our model right now, while we're testing, it's diesel is our backup. So as we build up and become more reliable, we're still using diesel to get people on the bus. Remember, we're still trying to be reliable and as frequent as we possibly can as we test these 2 models as we transition to zero emissions.
So if our baseline is 58 diesel buses,
Yes.
and we have a full build out of a battery electric of 94, that would suggest that we've got 36 of those are the coming on to finish up the second half of the day kind of thing.
Yes, sort of. So I want to make sure we understand. We don't have capacity or space to house 94 vehicles today.
Yeah.
So even if we acquire that other piece of property, we still don't have room for 94 vehicles because we still have to build that infrastructure to support whatever model we buy.
Do we have space for 58?
We do have space. With the addition of the other piece of property, we have space for 58 with the build out.
Okay, so to get to 90, we would have to not only buy the piece of property you have in mind, but find additional space as well.
Yes, continuous if we can.
Contiguous, yeah.
Because it allows us to manage the system as opposed to building out on 2 different sites.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
How many buses do we have now?
We have 40. We're building out to 58 in this model.
Okay. And is there precedent for building up for storage?
Is there what? I'm sorry.
Precedent for building up? Like instead of acquiring more land horizontally, we create more vertically?
We will be able to tell that when we do the space study. So that's the next phase. One of the things that a lot of transit agencies, I shouldn't say a lot, a number of transit agencies are doing is they're building enclosed garages to keep them out of the elements, out of the weather, especially on the BEB side of the house. In there, we may be able to build a 2-tier garage where you'd be able to maximize storage and also fueling. So that is a possibility. It just becomes more expensive.
Of course.
A few questions, and to the previous conversation, I'll still say even with difficulties that may exist with fast charging, to me the more realistic route, if we were talking about a conversion to BEB, would still be fast charging, which seems beneficial even just in terms of the fleet size. That seems more feasible to me cost-wise than having a fleet that's like 94. But a few questions. I know that before the results of this study, the city had engaged in a pilot project for electric buses. I think there were 2 of them. Are the 2 in this study basically those, or is this in addition to that previous existing pilot?
Those are the 2 we're referring to, the 2 that we're going to order within the next 60 days.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
The other question, when it comes to hydrogen, So for the purposes of this pilot, will it be green hydrogen or it will be blue, gray, whatever's available?
The goal would be green hydrogen. That would be our goal.
So there wouldn't necessarily be a guarantee that these would be zero emission hydrogen buses.
So if we're building out the model, we're going to build it to the green standard. That means that would be optimal. We're not going to build it out with the gray hydrogen that's going to not get us to the zero emissions standard that we already set.
And for acquisition of the fuel, is there a known source for either green hydrogen or blue or gray hydrogen, and kind of what that cost looks like at the moment?
So gray hydrogen is available. It would need to be trucked in. You can set up for a pilot mobile fueler that's self-contained. You can drop it off anywhere with 120 volt electric service, and it's a grounding rod and it's good to go. You can surround it with Jersey barriers. You don't have to, make a multi-million-dollar investment in your facility to be able to pilot that. In terms of the cost of the fuel, I want to say, and John, Paul, please jump in. I've seen like $8, what translates to about $8 per gallon most recently, but please, John or Paul, correct me. I know there's facilities, I know Lancaster, there's a facility there that produces hydrogen and can truck it in for you. So.
And I know in the recommendations there would be a period of a couple years where the two BEBs would be online before hydrogen fuel cell buses are acquired. As just a theoretical example, not saying this would necessarily be the result, but let's say in that period those two BEBs were a success. By that point, the technology for hydrogen, or at least green hydrogen, hasn't developed to the point where it seems cost-effective or deployable. Would there be any room for adjustment in those interim years, or would it be locked in that we would proceed with the hydrogen buses?
So you mean not do the pilot at all? Is that what you're?
Well, just because there's a gap between the two battery electric before procurement of the hydrogen, it seems like the hydrogen rests in part on some assumptions in terms of the development of the technology and industry.
Part of the reason why we are looking at potentially doing two pilots is to make sure we get the mix of alternative fuel vehicles correct. I have concerns about putting all of our eggs in one basket. As a concern, like the other night when we had our snowstorm, when the temperature dropped, and we've talked to other transit agencies, they weren't able to get the range that they had initially, which means if we go 100% a model and we don't have the extra capacity, we would have more buses stranded and not been able to fulfill. So that's what I'm hedging against as we potentially introduce two alternative fuel cells and still getting to zero emissions. Because we could basically just do BEB and a diesel, but we don't get 100% B to 100% zero emissions. So this allows us to be to play our options, but also provide us with realistic feedback on how those vehicles are going to operate here, but also build in a redundancy in case something happens.
Mm-hmm. And so, separate from the exploration of developing green hydrogen on site, the additional infrastructure that's needed, even with that taken out of the equation, to do that simultaneously with the I guess it would be overnight charging infrastructure at first for the battery electric buses, would both those, the infrastructure needed for both hydrogen and the BEBs still require that acquisition of that additional property, just in terms of the space and size of both of those simultaneously being installed?
Yes. We'd have to do that regardless of whether we did just BEB or just hydrogen. We need it for the space capacity anyway.
Okay. Yeah, I'll echo some of the questions that Councilor Pinkston had raised. It seems to me, at least initially, it would be gray or probably blue hydrogen. Acquired seems most realistic, unless there's a large breakthrough in the technology. Because I don't think even the new hydrogen hubs, whenever they're built, are going to be doing green hydrogen, at least initially. So particularly when just seeing like production of green hydrogen on site, some of the redundancy in terms of two different infrastructure investments. I don't know. I'm not a scientist. Maybe I'm wrong. I just have a hard time seeing the technology, which is much newer than even battery electric buses, developing in this timeline, especially if we're going to be doing green hydrogen and not just blue or gray.
I mean, I hear your concerns. We also echo your concerns. Transit works well when it is fast, frequent, reliable, safe. We're trying to make sure we do our due diligence. We build out our model. We test it before we make tremendous capital outlays in time and costs and the amount of money that we're going to spend. We want to be very good stewards of the public dollar.
And sorry, one final question that raises is, I know this is, whatever path is taken, it's extremely difficult in terms of both technology, planning, capital investment, procurement, and as you've mentioned, this is occurring in the context of a fleet expansion, particularly with the Regional Transit Vision Plan, a substantial fleet increase. When you're looking at the complexity of this change, both in terms of the management of buses, routes, the changes, and I guess I would assume for both technologies, hydrogen and BEBs, additional training that's needed for maintenance staff, is this something that you would see would require potentially like a new position in terms of like managing this fleet transition?
Several. Several new positions. There's no way one person can take care of all this. This is an effort not just by CAT. The Office of Sustainability is going to play a major role. Neighborhood services, neighborhood development is going to play a role. There's a lot of folks, public works, public utilities potentially in this model. There are lots that are going to be in this boat rowing in the same direction.
So, yeah. You finish, Michael?
Go ahead.
My question, a lot of them have been already asked, and I'm looking at the time. I just had couple of points. One, I would like if we could get that Oakland study, I think, that you mentioned, where they're doing a quarterly comparison. If that's something that it's free or whatever, I would love to have that. But I would like to know if any locality looked at all of this, because the doubling in the cost really concerns me. If you says, that doesn't concern me. I know it's more expensive, but that any locality say, you know what, this is just a lot. What if we double our diesel buses? Make it more frequent. It may not reduce the emission of the CAT or the bus system, but if you are able to say, we can provide service every 10 minutes, that would I think it would take a lot of cars off the street. So overall, the numbers will go down. Has anyone looked at that? Because $1.2 to $1.3 million for a bus compared to $500,000. That's just the bus. We have a lot to do. I'm looking at storing the fuel cell, and you mentioned off-site support for. It's a lot that goes along with this, and we're really not at this point doing a lot to increase the frequency of it. It's going to be cleaner, but I I'm not a regular user of the bus, but I do work with, professionally with a lot of people in my position as a career services person, that they want the frequency. They want that, they're not saying that necessarily they want it cleaner. I'm not saying that they don't. A lot of people that want it cleaner, they don't necessarily use the transit, and I'm making a general statement, but you see where I'm coming from with this?
I do, sir. So, great points that you pointed out. So, allow me to quickly paint a picture for you. Charlottesville Area Transit, if we double our size and we make our system more reliable and more frequent, I am confident that we would get people out of their automobiles. The study where we have looked at how people use our system, where they want to go, and the changes that we need to make it more direct to those points of activity centers and points of origin. If we were to make it double our size, make it more frequent, I think it has an environmental impact by just getting people out of their automobile, period.
That environmental impact would be positive, or?
That would be a positive,
okay,
right? So right now we're, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but I will. We're at a point right now where we have a system where we have 40 vehicles on our property. Today, I only had access to 20 of them. 10 of them are the hybrid battery electric vehicles. They have been down. They don't work. They stay in our shop more than they're on the road. And then on any given day, with the temperatures being so cold, we have had breakdowns with some of the other ones. So we only had 20 vehicles to our available to us today. My concern is I want us to become as clean, but I also want us to be pay attention to providing this region with fast, frequent, reliable transportation. I think we can do both. Let's just do it in a very measured way. Let's do the testing and figure out what that complement looks like.
Thank you.
A question that came to mind in that discussion is, I know part of this is obviously with the Inflation Reduction Act, bipartisan infrastructure law. There's a substantial amount of federal money available for the first time for both buses and infrastructure, changing for the locality, the cost of those buses, what we incur. At what point, so if we were to assume in one scenario that a substantial part of the zero-emission bus fleet years out from now is BEBs, it would seem like fast chargers are probably part of the infrastructure to make that work. Is there any point over the next several years where we would be evaluating, as a result of this pilot or something that's coming after this, if fast charging infrastructure is necessary, when we would seek federal money for that? Because whatever that phase-out period is for when that federal money is available will obviously substantially change the feasibility in terms of cost to us as a locality. And so there's kind of like a time window on the availability of that money. I don't know if that question makes sense, but...
It absolutely makes sense. So I would say that by you bringing it to our attention, it's on our radar now. So we would, as we're doing our testing, we're going to be able to tell whether, with the charging just being done at CAT, how reliable it is, whether they can make the whole route or not. And then we look at where we would potentially have to acquire property to do en route testing, en route charging, and have a real conversation with council about the infrastructure needed, locations that we potentially have to buy, and what that costs, what that looks like. So there is time to do all of what you've asked as we're testing this out.
And what specific are you looking for us tonight?
Tonight, I'm actually just
Providing In other words, is this the direction that the city's planning to go, and you're just kind of giving us an update, or you?
We're giving you an update. If you would like to give us, what I would say is today, we were giving you the information to allow you an opportunity to get the information, digest it, and come back and figure out whether this is the direction you think you want us to go. If this is the direction you want us to go, then we move to the next phase where we start to do the site planning and start to work towards getting the actual transition plan written. Then that opens up the funding sources for us.
Yeah, so, yeah, I'm supportive of that, but we haven't done the test, the piloting yet. That may say that.
You're asking us for approval to do the pilot, right?
Correct.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
To
yeah.
do both, to do the pilots, both of them. That way we'll be able to.
Pilots of the electric and the hydrogen.
That's correct. Then that way we'd be able to say, to tell which direction we need to move much more aggressively in, because we know the model works.
And that would be a formal action at our next council meeting, right?
No,
Because we don't vote.
no, not tonight either. The thought process that I have on this matter, because it's multi-layered, but financial specifically, because I'm in budget world right now, and no one wants to join me there at the moment. You need time with this, is my opinion. So the desire was for you to have this information this evening, and have you spend a little time with it, thinking further about any other questions, allow Mr. Williams to get you any additional information that came up in this discussion. I'm sure you will hear from our advocates who have interest in making some different decisions, so that you'll be able to have that information as well. And my desire was to have you come back into another work session, more like what you did during the zoning ordinance back in city space. And we're probably going to be on a whiteboard writing up some things and figuring out what is the decision that you all need to make to give him, Mr. Williams, the best direction on how to go forward.
You anticipate that like after the budget? Like,
Nope, next month.
Oh, next month.
We don't have
oh.
time because I have yet another big issue for you coming right after that, so we're going to do it while we do the budget.
Okay.
So the goal will be to figure out when a work session could occur. I've actually spoken to Mr. Freeze about potentially using the joint session time period that you all have kind of in reserve for your meeting with the Planning Commission. They too are interested in the subject, so this might be an opportunity for us to just have a global discussion about the decision before you and allow you to make that decision next month.
Once that's all done, though, there will be a formal resolution we do need to bring to council that's supportive of whatever decision.
Yeah.
And that it will be inserted into our final document that we send to the FTA.
Could I, before we leave the topic, could I just express a couple of concerns that didn't come up in any of this discussion? The first concern that I have is the question of long-term supply of lithium and rare earth elements. Over 90% of the world's supply of rare earth elements is in the hands of countries that don't like us. We would be in a really bad spot if we wound up getting things sideways enough with China, Russia, Brazil, India, which are the four largest. And we have the world supply is 115 million tons, I guess it is. We have 1.5 million in our reserves. And if I'm looking at things 15 years down the road, I don't know that I can predict how that's going to work for us. That's point number one. Point number two, do I understand that the essence of green hydrogen is that you would have, for example, a solar system powering an electrolysis generation of hydrogen?
Yes.
Okay. At this point, I know that Joe Biden has invested billions of dollars in various hydrogen technologies, but when the Secretary of Energy came here last year to talk about it all, it was always quite clear that it was at least 5 years away and probably more like 10 years away before anything was going to get to market. And so that concerns me. I looked at the operating costs, say for a 20-year period, plus the vehicle and facilities costs, adding it all up, and battery electric buses come out by far the most expensive. Second is hydrogen. All the way down at the bottom end of things, the cheapest for a whole lot of reasons is if we can somehow get a market going of some size in renewable natural gas. Is there any, I mean, I've been looking up biogas kinds of things, and all I see is a lot of research being done about, well, we've got a prototype here for getting biogas out of this cow manure operation or something. Is there any real progress on that at this point?
Yes, so actually Arlington, the example that Paul went over earlier, their wastewater treatment facility is going to begin producing the RNG that they'll be using by 2028. Like, that's in design, it's happening. So I think you are seeing it implemented at some scales.
Do we know, is there enough research done on this to know what the capabilities would be? For example, could we take the water treatment plant at Moores Creek and somehow capture whatever is coming off of that? Is that going to generate enough for us to do anything with? Do we have any idea of how we would even figure that out?
Yeah, I don't believe that would generate enough for you to power a fleet this size.
Yeah.
I don't know how much research has gone into that, but I know we discussed it internally, and
Okay, so we got a closed session. We have to go. Lloyd, do you have any more questions?
No, that actually takes care of it. Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions? If not, can I get a motion to go into closed session? Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
You guys rocked it. Thank you so much. That was thank you. We were throwing questions at you left and right from the get-go. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm happy to do it.
Thank you.
Motion for a city council closed meeting pursuant to section 2.2-3712 of the Code of Virginia. I move that city council close this open meeting and convene a closed meeting as authorized by the Code of Virginia section 2.2-3711A8 for consultation with the city attorney regarding legal matters requiring the provision of legal advice for the following purposes. 1, legal matters related to the offer and acceptance of proffers. And 2, legal matters related to the effective date of ordinances and pursuant to Code of Virginia section 2.2-3711A7 for consultation with the city attorney pertaining to actual litigation where consultation or briefing in open meeting would adversely affect the litigating posture of the city council, specifically White v. Charlottesville.
Second.
Second. Please cast your vote. Motion passes. City council is now in closed meeting and will return at 6:30. For those joining by Zoom, there is a separate link for the 6:30 meeting. Thank you.